This is the Sony FX3 that I've been using for the last few years, and this is the Challenger. And if you're like me, you're trying to figure out, should you buy or keep the FX3 or go with the new Nikon Red camera? That's what we're gonna try to answer in this video. If you're interested, I'm gonna try to give you some more information as best I can, because this camera is wild. And it's like half the price of this one. Buying a new camera is a big deal. It's a big investment of money, and it's not just the body, it's also the lenses, cages, microphones, and all the other accessories. So I'm gonna do my best to give you advice and help you make your next camera purchase decision. I don't know how this happened. Nikon bought Red, and their first camera together, the Nikon Red ZR, is incredible. And you're seeing people's reactions now. This was like one of the hardest secrets for me to keep, just because I knew this camera is special. And I think right now, the best prosumer cameras on the market are the FX3 and the Nikon ZR in this kind of category of cameras. And that is the calculus that all of us are gonna be doing is, should I stick with the FX3 or should I switch to Sony, or should I go with the Nikon ZR, which feels, I know this feel, I'm having the exact same feeling, like, Nikon, are you sure? Like, it feels a little like, I don't know if I trust this. And I think it'll take a little while for people to actually like open themselves up to like potentially switching, because it's just so outlandish. And I think as we're doing this comparison, we need to keep in mind that the Nikon ZR is almost half the price of the FX3. It's only $2,200. And so for some people, that's already the nail in the coffin for the FX3. They just can't go there. That's too much money. It's too expensive. And so automatically, the ZR just becomes like the de facto perfect situation for them. That being said, this is the comparison between the Sony FX3, my favorite camera for the last 5 years, and the brand new Nikon ZR. We're gonna go through lots of side-by-side comparisons. You're gonna get my honest real-time feedback, talk about the autofocus, the slow motion, the LCDs, card slot, low light, file sizes, all of it. But as we do, keep in mind that price. And I will say, as I was editing my Nikon ZR video, I was just getting more and more excited about this camera. It is so easy to color grade. The image looks incredible. And so, yeah, I might be slightly on the ZR hype right now, but I think it might be for good reason. I've always been one of these people that if Canon makes the best camera for me, I switch to Canon immediately. If Fujifilm makes the best camera for me, I switch to Fujifilm immediately. I have no loyalty in terms of like what brand I use, but at the same time, when I think this is the best camera, I will tell everyone about it. And I feel like the ZR might be replacing the FX3 as this camera that I tell everybody about. So first off, let's talk about the biggest thing, image quality. That is the biggest point, the biggest thing that all of us are gonna be looking at and comparing. And so let's take a look at some of these side-by-sides, because I think it'll be quite eye-opening. So I'm noticing a few things, 3 big things here. First off, to me, the ZR has so much more actual detail, not just like, let's sharpen, actual detail. Now, obviously we're shooting in 6K Red RAW versus H.265 on the FX3, but that's the best we can get out of the FX3. And so that's the comparison that we have to make. And I think this actually is like a apples to apples comparison. The data rate is a little different, but like pretty much this is apples to apples. This is how I would compare them. Right away, to me, the colors look more natural on the ZR. I like them more, even though I like FX3 colors a lot. I'm super used to them too. I love it. But I will say the ZR right out of the camera looks better to me. And I often look at the detail part. There's a big difference between just sharpening and detail. And when you like punch in, you notice pretty quickly that on FX3, there isn't actually that much like detail. Like it gets pretty mushy pretty quick if you just zoom in even a little bit and start really pixel peeping. It still looks great somehow. I love the way it looks still. I think that 12 megapixel sensor just works well, and I'm surprised other companies haven't, you know, caught on to that. Like, why does it work so well? But the 24 megapixel sensor of the Nikon with the Red RAW, there's way more detail. You look at the beard, you look at the hair, there's just so much more detail there without it looking like digitally sharp, if that makes sense. And that is super important to me. I don't want digital sharpness. I hate that. In fact, I'm usually throwing on lenses that like dumb down the digital sharpness look. But this doesn't look digital sharp. Actually, the FX3 looks more digitally sharpened to me, which kind of makes sense. And the ZR looks just like it has more detail. And then I'm also noticing right away that the ZR just has more dynamic range. The FX3 has great dynamic range. The ZR, in my opinion, has more. And when you're actually real world using it, to me, throughout this whole process, the ZR has more dynamic range. And that is like one of the most important things I can think about in terms of a camera. And even my editor Spencer, when he was looking at the ZR footage, he's like, this looks similar to like Arri footage. And I haven't done a comparison between Arri and the ZR, but I agree, it looks really detailed and nice, and the dynamic range is incredible. Now, interestingly, kind of like on the Arris, I feel like there is maybe a little bit more noise on the ZR. Like if you really pixel peep, it looks like there's more noise than on the FX3. Again, maybe this makes sense, but I would maybe characterize it more as like the FX3 has like big noise, and like if you go off base ISO, it gets real bad real fast. You can basically only use 640 and 12,800. On the ZR, the noise looks a lot like finer, and it kind of looks like there's more chroma, like colored noise, but at the same time, it's more reminiscent of film grain to me, if that makes sense. And maybe just because it's smaller and not as like digital blocky. But yeah, that's like if you want a super clean image, like yeah, you can denoise and that kind of stuff. To me, I really like the Nikon ZR image, which is, even as I'm saying that, I'm like, what? It's a Nikon. You can't say that about Nikon video. Nikon video is not good. And here I am saying that I really, really like the Nikon ZR image, like, and color grading it. When I was color grading this footage, I've always liked color grading the FX3 footage. I think it's really easy to color grade. I think the Nikon ZR image is so much easier to color grade, like really easy. Like I think maybe the only other camera that I've had this experience with is Arri footage, where Arri footage is just consistently good somehow. And there aren't these like edge cases where like, I just can't get this to look nice. I felt the same way with the Nikon ZR footage, where every time it was just easy to color grade it. There was never like oh, I have to do a ton of work to get this like to a good place. It just looked good. And I think the colors look more accurate to life, at least. I'm noticing like on the Sony footage, there's always a bit of like a green tint to it. The Nikon ZR looks a lot more balanced straight out of camera, in my opinion. Now, we can get the FX3 to the right point pretty easily, but it's nice to just have it right out of the camera. Now, some of you are still gonna be like, well, this is still unfair. You're comparing Red RAW and then H.265, and I agree. So let's take a look at some of the H.265 footage. And yeah, I think once we get to the H.265 footage, that's where, like, I described in my review that it feels like there's two cameras inside the ZR. There's the Nikon camera and there's the Red camera. The Red camera is sick. The Nikon camera is... So when you're shooting an H.265, the colors right away go a little bit wonky. They're not as nice as in the FX3, in my opinion. It takes a lot more work to get it to a good place. And like I was talking about earlier, sometimes it's just like, I can't get this to look like I want it to. All right, after looking at the footage more, I am less inclined to say that the FX3 looks better. I think maybe I'm also just way more used to the FX3, so it's way easier for me to get the colors where I want them to be. I think the image actually does look really, really nice also in H.265. It's just going from the Red look then to the Nikon H.265, it's such a big change that maybe that's also throwing me off a little bit. But I will say it's not clear cut that the FX3 is better here. I think in some ways the ZR is better. It's got more detail and stuff. In some ways, I think the colors are a little bit easier to work with on the FX3. So For me, it's kind of hard to say, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe this part is stupid now because I don't necessarily think what I said anymore. I'm also noticing that basically on every shot, there's more contrast in the mid-tones. Not like the overall contrast, just in the mid-tones. There's more contrast on the Nikon than on the FX3. So it just makes things pop a little bit more. I think I like that because you're still getting the full dynamic range, but then just like the mid-tones have a little bit more like, it's not clarity necessarily, but it's a little bit more contrast. And actually that makes, in the red profile especially, that makes color grading a lot easier. And so, yeah, you're right. If you're shooting an H.265, I think the FX3 looks better. I think the quality in terms of detail and colors and all that stuff, dynamic range, even dynamic range, you don't get as much dynamic range in the Nikon H.265 codec as you do in the Red RAW. So it starts being much more like even, and I would say here's where the FX3, in my opinion, just wins. It looks better, in my opinion. So if you just shot H.265 always, and you never use the Red RAW, I think the FX3 wins here. Now, the Red RAW is in there, and it is incredible, and it is, in my opinion, much better than the FX3 H.265 image. And some of you might be thinking, like, I've been through this before. I bought a camera that had RAW and I never used it. I've done that exact same thing before. I think this is actually different. I think that the Red RAW is easy enough to use. Right now, you can't just use it straight in DaVinci and stuff, but soon you will be. And once you can do that, I feel like there's no reason to not shoot in the Red RAW. So in terms of image quality, I have to give it to the Nikon ZR. That is 1 point for the Nikon. And that's like the craziest point I think out of this whole comparison. I did not expect that at all. Now let's right away talk about then file sizes. So file sizes, that is the big worry always with RAW. The file sizes actually aren't that bad. So if you're shooting in H.265, the highest quality on the FX3, it's gonna be 100 megabits per second. On the Nikon ZR, if you're shooting in the highest quality 6K Red RAW, 24 frames per second, it's 190 megabits per second. So almost double, yes, but that's still not crazy. To me, that is very doable. And for that quality boost increase, I would do it. I would take the extra data for sure. And so if it was like 1000 megabits per second or something, then I'd be like, I think most of us unfortunately just aren't gonna use it. And so it kind of sucks. 190, very doable. And so I think I give this one to the Nikon. They did a really good job of essentially dumbing it down enough that it's still very usable for this class of cameras. Remember, we have to talk about who is this camera for. It's not for the Hollywood productions. It's for the casual prosumer, wedding shooter, documentaries. You're doing little commercials. You're doing music videos. You're doing any of that kind of stuff. And in those cases, you don't want terabytes and terabytes of footage. If you're working on big time commercials, terabytes and terabytes of footage doesn't matter as much. It still does. You wouldn't think it does. It still does. They're thinking about it too. That's why people don't shoot airy RAW most of the time, because it's just insane file sizes. But yeah, I think I gotta give another point for the ZR. This was a great job. We still have the H.265, great, but the Red RAW is doable in terms of data. Then let's talk autofocus. I did some tests with the autofocus moving around, and there was no situation where I'm like, oh, the Nikon is way worse or the FX3 is way better or worse. To me, they look very similar. I think you're just gonna have to dial in the settings, like the way they work might be a little bit different. So maybe like sensitivity 3 or what, I don't even know what they call them in the Nikon. Maybe that's different from the FX3. And so you're gonna have to dial it in so that it works for you. But just straight default, these were the default settings. I had no issues with autofocus. It works great, which is incredible. And I think this makes it the first red camera with autofocus. Yes, the Komodo X or something, that had autofocus, but like, did it really? I don't think it worked very well, so I wouldn't quite classify that as a red camera with autofocus. Autofocus is great. I'm gonna give a point for both. Autofocus works. No issues there. Then let's talk about slow motion. So this is where things get a little bit interesting. At first, I was like, Oh, crop on the ZR, yeah, FX3 wins slow motion for sure. So they can both do 120 frames per second, but the ZR has a slight crop, the FX3 doesn't, and I love that. I hate that when there's like a crop. But then I realized, wait a second, it's 4K 120 frames per second in Red RAW on the ZR. And so with that in mind, I don't really know how to score this one. I think if it wasn't Red RAW, I would for sure give it to the FX3. It's just better in slow motion. It's really nice. There's a slight crop on the ZR, and so that's annoying, but it's Red RAW. I did not expect it to be Red RAW, 120 frames per second. As much as it hurts me, I think I gotta give it a tie. If I could like score it, it would maybe be like a slightly bigger point for the FX3, and then the Nikon still gets a point. But I think this is a tie. I think the slow motion is actually great. At first I was like, oh, the slow motion is the big downside. And we get 60 frames per second, 6K Red RAW. That is incredible. So I think we give both a point. Slight differences, know the differences. I don't think either is gonna be a hindrance or a big bother to you. Both do great slow motion. That's good news. Then let's talk about the body. And I talked to a few people and they're just like, oh, great image, but the body is horrible. It's so bad. It's blah, blah, blah. I think I disagree with that. I 100% agree it would be great to have mounting points, more mounting points. There's only one mounting point on the Nikon ZR. That being said, it is super lightweight. I like the shape of it. It's essentially like a ZV-1 type, like it's skinny, kind of like a rectangle. It feels nice in the hand to me. People are gonna freak out that it doesn't have like a really like strong like hand grip thing. I honestly, I liked using it. When I was using it, I never was like, oh, this sucks. And I think where people are freaking out is the whole like, oh, but it's gonna be terrible to put a cage on it. And that is where I think my thinking goes in a different direction. I think in general, we cage cameras because they don't have the things we need. They need a bigger LCD screen. We need to put in all these audio stuff. So we need to cage it and then add all that stuff on there. Battery life is crappy or whatever. So we need to add a V mount. We need to put a cage on it. In this case, I don't know if we really need a cage as much. Again, think about who this camera is for. It's for that prosumer, you know, that like middle category, small to medium budget projects. I don't know if you need to cage this. And so I think if we just looked at the body, like mounting points and all that, we're gonna give FX3 a point. Let's give FX3 a point on that. But then let's look at the LCD screen. The LCD screen is so good on the Nikon ZR that it is laughable now trying to use the FX3. It is like a joke. The LCD screen is so much better on the ZR, to the point it's 4 inches. That do you really need to mount a 5-inch monitor when you already have a really great 4-inch monitor on there? I think not. I would much prefer not to rig it out and put a cage on there, put a monitor on there, and then I need a battery to power the monitor. I would much rather just have a really great monitor built into the camera. And so, do I need to cage it? Not really. And so the LCD screen is a huge point for the Nikon ZR. Now, micro HDMI on the Nikon ZR, but again, I did the like, would you rather thing. Would you rather have full-size HDMI and always have to plug in a monitor like on the FX3? Or would you rather have a really nice monitor and micro HDMI? I would rather take the micro HDMI. That's just me. That's not that big of a deal. It's kind of stupid, but also, I don't care because I'm probably not gonna put a monitor on this thing most of the time. And then along with this whole having to put a cage on there, let's talk about the audio. The Nikon ZR has 32-bit float built in. That means that you're never gonna blow your audio. It's never gonna be too quiet or too loud. As long as the feed that's going into the camera is not blowing out like from your lavs or something like that, you are safe. Like we've all done this before where we messed up our audio and it really, really sucks. You can't do that on the Nikon ZR, which means that you probably have much more leeway in terms of what microphones you use and how you do audio versus, let's say, on the FX3, and that's why you need that top handle and XLRs and all that stuff. And we're still gonna get a lot of those accessories, I think, through Nikon. They're gonna make some sort of XLR, you know, whatever. But the 32-bit float also just, I think, influences how much you have to rig this thing out. And so again, do I need to cage it? I don't know. I hope somebody makes a really small, low profile cage that adds a few mounting points just in case I need them. But I'm probably not gonna cage this thing too often. And so audio is 100% a win for the Nikon ZR. It is just so nice having 32-bit float. I don't know how every camera should have 32-bit float. That is like a no-brainer. If they can do it in small little like lav devices, they can do it inside a camera. I will say though, the top handle situation is, I would call vicarious. That is the one part that I'm like, how is that gonna work when there is no mounting points on top to make it secure? So if you want a top handle, you probably do need some sort of cage. That is the only thing that like makes me think, oh, okay, yeah, maybe you still do need a cage. I wish they would have just put 2 mounting points on the top of the Nikon ZR so that they could have a really sturdy handle. That I think is a big miss on the Nikon ZR. But I'm very curious to see how they do like the little XLR unit on there. Maybe they somehow figure out how to do a nice handle that still kind of works. Let's talk about card slots. FX3 has dual card slots. The Nikon ZR has a good card slot and then a micro SD. So like FX3 wins that one for sure. Point FX3. Then let's talk about low light. Right off the bat, you look at the specs, you're like, well, the FX3 is better at low light because the base ISOs on the FX3 are 640 and 12,800. Incredible. On the ZR, they are 800 and 6,400. Still great, very great. I love having dual base ISO, but not as good as the FX3. So low light, you can look at the differences. I think the ZR is really great in low light still. I don't think it's gonna be a problem for most people, especially if they have a nice fast lens, an f1.4 or an f1.2. Nikon has some nice ones there. So I don't think it's bad. And even at like the max ISOs, I feel like you could denoise and probably be kind of fine. But typically I just stick to base ISOs. So yeah, we're gonna give the FX3 a point here. But the ZR, I don't think you're gonna have any issues with low light. Both are great low light cameras, but of course the FX3 is like built with a 12 megapixel sensor to be a low light camera. Then we gotta do price. Price is clearly on the side of the Nikon ZR. There's no getting around that. The FX3 is almost twice the price. I almost feel like at this point, the FX3 is quite old. And so if the FX3 Mark II doesn't come out soon, I think Sony has to drop the price, but maybe that just pisses off a lot of people who bought the FX3 more recently, so maybe they can't. But like, I don't think that the FX3 is quite worth that price in a way right now. It's a great camera still, so it's hard to say that. But now with this Nikon ZR and that price, it's like, I don't know. It should be, I think, a little bit cheaper. So I'm gonna give the point to the Nikon ZR. It is definitely cheaper, but that leads us to the other, probably more expensive thing, and that is lenses. That is gonna be the biggest thing for most people who are thinking like, should I switch to the Nikon? Is like, but the lens is just gonna, it's way more than just buying a new body. Having lenses, that is like the most expensive part of filmmaking pretty much. This is a Sony 50mm f1.2. This is a Z mount Nikon 50mm f1.2. Look at the size difference, massive size difference between these lenses. And that is definitely something to think about, because it's not just the camera you're buying, you are investing in a completely different ecosystem, different lenses. And if you already have a bunch of Sony lenses, this, times a few lenses in your lens bag, it's a big difference. Even just weight wise, this is so much heavier than the Sony lens. I will say though, whenever I see big glass, I think that the lens is just gonna be nicer. I don't know if that's true or not, but Nikon has massive glass, so I don't know, maybe this one's better. Maybe it's worth it. Maybe it's not. Maybe you can't tell any difference. I don't know. And if you look at lenses for Canon RF, there's only 205 lenses. For Nikon Z mount, there are 338 lenses, which is really great. For Sony E-mount, there's 589 E-mount lenses. That is incredible. And so I think in terms of just pure lenses, the FX3 wins this. Sony's done such a good job of making lenses and opening it up to third parties to make lenses. I think this is one of the biggest reasons that Sony is so popular, is there's so many lens options. And one of the reasons why Canon is not doing as well is because they really locked down the RF mount. They shouldn't have done that. They should have opened it up. The more lenses, the better, but they were greedy. They wanted to sell the lenses, their own lenses, and I think they're really hurting because of that. Now, I thought that this was gonna be a big problem because in terms of Nikon, they don't have a 16-35 f2.8. Like, hello? What? That is like bizarre to me. To me, that's part of the holy trinity: 16-35, 24-70, 70-100. Those are the three most important zoom lenses, and they just don't have the first one. And they also don't have a 24mm 1.4, which maybe for you that sounds like, why is he picking that? That is my favorite lens. That's what I'm using right now. It is incredible. I love 24mm f1.4, incredible. They don't have it. But then I realized that I did not know this, but there is just enough space to use an adapter and use E-mount lenses on a Z mount camera, which means I could potentially just use all my Sony lenses. This is the Sigma 35mm f1.2. I could just use this on that Nikon and not have to buy all new lenses. That is incredible. And so far, I've seen a few people say that they've been doing this for years. Autofocus is great. That is awesome. That is so nice to hear, because that would have been the biggest reason why I would not switch to the ZR, is if I did not have the right lenses to use. I just can't do it. If I don't have the right lenses, I just can't do it. And so essentially, not only do you have 338 Z mount lenses, you essentially have 338 plus 589 lenses to choose from, and plus tons of more. I bet you can adapt basically anything. If you can do E mount to Z mount, you can basically do any lens with an adapter. And that is incredible. That is awesome. So just purely what the lenses are, like E mount versus Z mount, FX3 gets the point. But I think we have to give a point to Nikon here for being really smart with this. I don't know if they actually did this on purpose or by accident, but the fact that you can adapt an E mount lens to the Z mount is so smart and so good that I want to give them a point for that, because yeah, that actually makes it way more easy to switch to the ZR right now. I just don't see why I wouldn't have a ZR body on hand at all times, even if I still continue to use my Sony FX3. And lastly, I need to do color grading as a category by itself. I know we talked about image quality. I think in terms of color grading, the Nikon ZR with that red raw is easier to color grade. The image ends up being nicer. You will have way less headaches in color grading. And so I want to give another point for the Nikon ZR because I think that is a big deal for a lot of people, especially if you're not good at color grading. This makes it so much easier to get really nice looking footage. And I'm so glad that they went with a 12-bit, slightly dumbed down version, not like the 16-bit, crazy data. This was super smart by Nikon. Did I just say that Nikon was being smart in terms of video? Because that was the first time in my life that I've said that. I didn't do extensive rolling shutter, but from everything I've seen so far, I think my estimates were correct that the rolling shutter is just slightly better on the FX3 than the Nikon ZR, which is actually a win for the Nikon because you're shooting in 6K red raw. You would think, oh, the rolling shutter, the readout speed would be pretty bad, and the readout speed seems to be really good. I'm tempted to give it to the FX3, but I think this is, again, kind of a point for both of them. I think they're really close. They're both really great. I don't think you're gonna have any issues with rolling shutter on either camera. I like that. So after tallying up the points, you can see that it's very, very close, and you might have scored them slightly differently. So I think it's like very, very, very close. But again, I think you have to look at this from the lens of that price. And I think like the image quality category, it's probably worth more than 1 point if you're comparing like dual card slots and image quality, like very different categories. So the big question is, should you be switching or buying the Nikon ZR? And here's kind of what I would say right now quickly. I feel like I need to do a whole video just comparing or talking about the 3 cameras right now, the FX3, the Nikon ZR, and the new Canon C50. Which camera should you use? Which one is the best for you? But right now, if we're talking about the FX3 and the ZR, I think as a Sony user for 5+ years now, this is the first camera where I'm genuinely actually thinking about getting one. And I don't think I need to get rid of my FX3s, if that makes sense. But I have a feeling I'm gonna get the Nikon ZR, and I'm probably gonna end up using it more and more and more, to the point where the FX3 just gets, you know, left on the shelf. Now, when is Sony gonna come out with the FX3 Mark II? Is that gonna come soon? I have no idea. That could completely change things. But me as an FX3 user, I have no reason to not get a camera body that's $2,200, fairly reasonable, and just start using the lenses I have right now. It is incredible. Like that camera, the more I think about it, it's unreal for that price. What we're getting is crazy. You know, I think if you're, you know, right now using like an iPhone for video and you're like, I want to get my first real camera, if you're using like a very cheap version of a mirrorless or whatever, like a very budget level, the Nikon ZR makes all the sense for you. It is so good for that price. That is the camera that I'm going to be recommending to like anybody who's like, I'm thinking about getting into video. Get the Nikon ZR. If you can afford it, it is incredible. If you are a Sony user right now, I don't think your work is gonna suffer if you don't have the ZR. I don't think people are gonna notice that much in the end. They're like, oh, is that the ZR or the FX3? The quality, like, I don't think people will realize. They look at the work. Is the work good? If the work is good, nobody's gonna really notice between the FX3 and the ZR, let's be honest. But if you're thinking about like, should I get another FX3? I need a second body. Get the ZR. It's an easy decision. Get the ZR. Might be a little bit annoying having to match the cameras, but I think the ZR offers things that the FX3 does not right now. If you're Canon still for video, yeah, that is a tough conversation. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's tough. The one thing I will say is that Sony still has the full lineup. Like you get an affordable camera and you work your way up all the way to the highest end Venice cameras. I just heard one of my favorite DPs. He was just I was messaging with him. He's like, I've actually been using the Venice a lot lately, and that is interesting. Like Arri is not, you know, the de facto necessarily always anymore for the super high end projects. So Sony has the full lineup, whereas Nikon, well, I guess you could say that you go from like this to a red camera, but that's like a whole different world. You're doing a massive jump all of a sudden. I don't think that they have the camera graduation effect going on. I made a whole video about that, how Blackmagic is starting to, I think, do that fairly well. Sony does it the best still. And so, yeah, I think it'll be hard for a lot of people to switch to a Nikon. I know that feeling that you're feeling right now, but I think as time goes on, more and more people are gonna switch to the ZR, and depending how long it takes Sony to release something interesting, more and more people are just gonna pick up the ZR because it's very affordable and it's really good. And if Nikon can do that, convert a few people, and show them that they can actually do good video, that is a huge win for Nikon. Well done, Nikon. That is all I can say. Well done. All right, I hope this helped you to get some more information, get a little more thoughts in your head about which camera you should go for. But I think for most people right now, I would recommend the Nikon ZR. I said it. All right, bye guys.